welcome everyone. My name is Fred Joya. I'm a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst in Dallas, Texas. I am the team lead for the workshop series of the Committee on Artificial Intelligence. If you are not familiar with the Committee on Artificial Intelligence, our mission from APSA's Department of Psychoanalytic Education is to study the intersections of AI and psychoanalysis, and on the basis of those studies, develop educational projects. One of our animating ideas for the Council on Artificial Intelligence is that if the AI revolution will serve human needs and values and not just demands for corporate profit and military power, then psychoanalytic thinking is necessary. Our workshops are a way of exercising our belief at the CAI that the world at large can use psychoanalytic ideas to understand the AI revolution. A few things about our organization. We do publish a report, the CAI report. If you're not familiar with it, I can post a link to it in the chat. It's a monthly or so newsletter that comes out with different writings from members of the CAI and others. I would highly encourage you to read it to get a better grip on what we're doing here. But with that said, let's start with Fernando, Dr. Castrillón. His talk today is entitled Epistemic Breaks, Artificial Intelligence, and the End of the Social Bond. Dr. Castrillón will be speaking about the madness that ensues when a reproduction of humanity or a human intelligence is presented to us as real. He will base his talk on an interpretation of Andrei Tarkovsky's film Solaris, where he will characterize our contemporary inability to ascertain veracity as an epistemic break with grave implications, including, but not limited to, the end of the social bond as we know it. We expect his presentation will be the basis for an enlivening, informative, and robust discussion. We are delighted by the opportunity to share his work and this conversation with our community. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Castrillón. He is a psychologist and practicing personal and supervising psychoanalyst. He's faculty of the Psychoanalytic Institute of Northern California. He's professor emeritus at the California Institute of Integral Studies and the founder of the Foundation of California Psychoanalysis. He is also the founding director of the Clinic Without Walls, an innovative psychotherapy clinic serving mostly poor and immigrant communities. Dr. Castrillón is an editor-in-chief of the European Journal of Psychoanalysis and a member of the, I hope I say this right, Istituto Elvio Facanelli, Institute of Advanced Studies in Psychoanalysis based in Rome. He serves on a variety of editorial boards, including the Journal of World Systems Research, and is the co-editor of 2 books and author of numerous articles in Spanish, German, Italian, Russian, and English. So that's a little bit about him. Before I hand it over, there's just a few things for the etiquette while we listen to him present. I do ask that everyone mutes their microphones. If you have any questions, please do not put them in the chat until after the presentation. It can be really distracting for the presenter. If you do write your question and are unable to speak your question after he's done in the Q&A, I'm happy to read it for you, so that's not a problem. But otherwise, without further ado, I will hand it over.
Thank you so much, Fred.
Sure.
Okay, so by way of beginning, I would like to thank all the members of the Council on Artificial Intelligence for this kind invitation to speak with you here today, particularly Fred Joya and Valerie Frankfelt. I would also like to acknowledge my dear friend Patrick Brooks, who is in attendance today, It was he who turned me on to the brilliant work of Stanislav Lem, who I will reference quite a bit in this talk. But he introduced me to his work many years ago while we were both laboring away in college. And a hearty thank you to all the attendees. I look forward to a robust and engaging discussion after I provide some preliminary remarks to prime the pump. Okay. So a little over 50 years ago, the brilliant Soviet filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky co-wrote and directed the great psychological science fiction film Solaris, based on Stanislav Lem's stunning novel of the same name. The plot centers on a space station orbiting the fictional planet Solaris, where a scientific mission has stalled due to the emotional crises that have befallen the skeleton crew of 3 scientists. Psychologist Chris Kelvin is sent to the station to evaluate the situation, only to encounter the same mysterious phenomena as the others. It would seem that a sentient ocean on the planet Solaris is able to read or decipher the unconscious of the mission scientists during their sleep, allowing the ocean to then artificially produce seemingly real and tangible people directly lifted from the fantasy material of each scientist. While we are left in the dark as to what was produced for the other scientists, the story centers on the fantasy production of the psychologist Chris Kelvin. In his case, it is his long-dead spouse, Hari, who died of suicide, which has materialized. In all cases, the fantasy productions are deeply disturbing and put into motion a growing sense of madness and debacle. The tie-in to artificial intelligence becomes readily apparent. The thesis of my talk, of course, is that any artificial reproduction of human or quasi-human intelligence that is presented to us as real will inevitably lead to a kind of madness, both social and subjective. More specifically, I characterize our contemporary inability to ascertain veracity. Is it AI or a human? Is the information presented true or false? I characterize this inability to actually figure out the truth of those things as an epistemic break with deeply troubling implications, the most severe one being the end of the social bond as we know it. But how have I arrived at this conclusion? So let's explore the film some to find this out. One of the things that quickly becomes clear in both the film and the novel is that Kelvin's attachment to the obviously artificial replica of Hari sits on a guilt, which Kelvin readily admits to Sartorius, one of the mission scientists that's on board the platform or the station that's floating above the planet Solaris. And it's a guilt in regards to the original Hari, but also a guilt that involves other events and fantasies. With the replica of Hari, he imagines getting something back that was lost. This is a key point. And that, right off the bat, I would argue, is one of the great appeals of AI, namely that it allows us to attribute aspects of the original lost object to the various productions that surge forth from AI's fevered digital machinations. And that will always be its appeal. It gives us a semblance, an artificial taste of what we might come to regain of a past loss. It's the stuff of fantasy, literally. So in Lacanian terms, the formula of the fantasy is nothing other than the complex relationship between the split subject and the lost object. Artificial intelligence upends this arrangement and produces a kind of das Ding, or object of desire. Das Ding, of course, German for the thing. The lost object that under most circumstances must be repeatedly rediscovered via its absence. To be clear, this lost object is nothing other than the forbidden object of incestuous desire. In other words, we are speaking here of the mother. Under most conditions, the pleasure principle acts to keep the subject at a certain remove from das Ding. The subject circles around it without ever grasping onto it. The life of fantasy is exactly this: a highly complex subjective choreography that keeps the subject and the lost object in relation to each other, always keeping das Ding inaccessible yet tantalizing. But what happens if the subject actually transgresses the pleasure principle and gains access to das Ding? Or to put it another way, what happens if das Ding ceases to function as an absence and actually materializes as a graspable presence, like Hari for Kelvin? Lacan spells this out in his Seminar 7, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis, where he notes that in this case, das Ding is experienced as suffering or evil. In the French, he terms it mal. It is a monstrous encounter. There's no other way of putting it. The end of the film is very telling in this respect. Kelvin experiences a kind of dream, bordering on memory, of an interaction with his mother. Interestingly, after the dream, Kelvin's intense sense of dread and madness seems to dissipate, and he finds himself at his parents' home. But then sometime later, it is revealed that the shift is itself an artifice, and that his sense of sanity and his parents' home is simply an island drawn from his unconscious. The whole thing is contrived, again raising the issue of veracity, or the status of truth in his life. What is clear from the film is that Kelvin wants to believe that the artifices presented to him are actually the case, that they are true. With AI amidst us, we have the license to not believe anything we don't want to. I'll say that again. With AI, we have license to not believe anything we simply do not want to believe. It is this that dissolves the social bond and any chance we might have for community. Artificial intelligence allows us a retreat onto an island of one, composed only of fantasy. AI does not facilitate an encounter with a real other, an encounter necessarily riddled with risk, but is the endpoint of the discourse of capitalism, life feeding off of itself. We become a digital, machinic Ouroboros. To speak further to the question of ascertaining veracity, it is now the case that our capacity to establish or ascertain veracity is impaired on at least two fronts. One, we are increasingly less capable of determining the factual truth of anything that is written or reported. Two, it is becoming progressively more difficult to determine the derivation of any supposed statement of fact. To put it together, it is getting damn difficult to determine who or what wrote or said a thing and whether that something is factually accurate or not. Without these two faculties, where are we? Some might like to float in the indeterminacy of the realms we're hyper-catapulting into, but psychoanalysis as a field demands something of a different order. This is not to say that facts are what analyses are made of. Of course not. Quite the contrary. But the field, via its manifold forms of literature and modes of transmission, does need to ascertain veracity in different and complex ways. This is now in serious jeopardy. Now, I should hasten to add that I'm not referring to any future version of AI, as if, the really sort of horrific things are way off on the horizon. No, I am directly speaking to the kinds of AI that are now all around us. The damage is already done, and while even worse renditions of AI may be in the offing, our current engagement with generative AI is already wreaking havoc. It is here that we can locate the epistemic break or rupture that I mentioned before. Now, I should note I am using the term in a different way than either Gaston Bachelard or Louis Althusser, who employed the expression to denote a kind of paradigm shift or overcoming of unconscious bias that is a normative aspect of the development of science. I'm using the phrase instead to capture a phenomena of our time, closely associated with the inability to ascertain veracity. By epistemic break, I am referring to the rupture between the knowledge we have received and how that knowledge was produced or came to be. Remember that epistemology is the branch of philosophy that examines the nature, origin, and limits of knowledge. A basic question epistemology asks is, how do we know what we know? With the advent of AI, what has been enacted is a severing of the link between the knowledge we work with and the manner in which it was brought into being. With artificial intelligence, we no longer have any clue as to how we know what we know. The means by which the knowledge was produced, its origins, its nature, and its boundaries are simply off limits and seemingly incomprehensible. We are no longer privy to the production of knowledge. We simply become passive consumers of said knowledge. AI trains us to eat without thinking. As part of a larger machinic apparatus that includes AI, other technologies, and ourselves, humans play the part of domesticated cattle. Going further, this AI supposed revolution provokes impacts in at least two other areas, the social and the subjective. In terms of the social, an inability to ascertain veracity is corrosive in that it allows all of us to fall further back into our echo chambers of trusted sources, because anything outside of that restricted realm is simply not to be believed. As we well know, for all its computing power, generative AI is incredibly inaccurate. This is a perennial and structural issue with AI that developers have yet to correct. To put it simply, we cannot yet believe what AI tells us. When faced with this sort of anxiety-provoking social media landscape, we retreat to that we can be sure of, and more importantly, to that which we want to believe. The end result, of course, is that no one talks to anyone else anymore, or better yet, we don't listen to each other any longer. This is the death of social intercourse and of the social bond. Lem himself, Stanislav Lem himself, makes a strikingly similar point when he notes the following, quote, "The principal weakness of all efforts focused on discovering the true state of events lies in the fact that a person who has suspicions as to the non-reality of the world in which he lives must act on his own. The person undergoing the experience via an engagement with AI type technologies," that's my addition there, "the person undergoing the experience cannot trust anyone but himself, which severely narrows down his options. He acts defensively to an extent, as he is surrounded from all sides. This also means that a phantomatic," here we can read that as AI, "that an AI world is a world of total solitude. No civilization can become fully phantomized, in other words, fully virtual. If all its members were to start experiencing phantomatic virtual visions from a certain point on, the real world of this civilization would come to a halt and die out. This would thus be a peculiar form of euthanasia, a kind of pleasant suicide of civilization." And I take that from Stanislav Lem's magnus opus, which I will speak more about later. It's a large theoretical tract that he wrote. But this shredding of the social field is necessarily accompanied, of course, by a kind of shredding of the subjective. Here I'm referring directly to the psychoanalytic clinic. This matter of the inability of ascertaining veracity has grave consequences for the transference and for the status of the analytic interpretation. While some of us might imagine that the power of the transference itself might be diluted by the inability to ascertain veracity more generally, which will undoubtedly happen, I would also suggest the opposite. If anything, I could see the transference becoming a kind of singular space of truth outside of the morass of innuendo, half-truths, and intentional disinformation campaigns brought to our doorstep by generative AI. But what does it do to hold the transference in this way, as a kind of lifeline in an otherwise decimated social field? I think here of interminable analyses, of psychoanalysis as a kind of permanent refuge, as opposed to embodying a time-limited space of reflection, inquiry, and creation, eventuating in an invention, that of leaving the couch so as to enter the social field again, but positioned otherwise. To put it differently, how do analyses properly end when they operate in a social field invaded by the vagaries and inaccuracies generated by AI and related techno-practices? Further observations. It is always an interesting experiment to compare a film with the novel it is based on. A comparison of Stanislav Lem's novel and Tarkovsky's film provides a trove of riches. While similar in some respects to each other, they also differ in remarkable and important ways. And it is no secret that Lem despised Tarkovsky's adaptation of his novel, making a set of trenchant critiques that still hold to this day. What becomes abundantly clear is that Lem's novel and his work more broadly speaks to the philosophical and existential issues brought about by artificial representations of human intelligence. So much so that a whole chapter entitled Phantomatics of Lem's philosophical magnum opus, Summa Technologiae, is dedicated to these problematics. In fact, it could be said that Lem was addressing the potential impacts of AI in the early 1960s, which is when he wrote that book, before it even existed. My following remarks draw on both Lem's novel Solaris and his Summa Technologiae. For example, in describing the sentient ocean of Solaris, Lem underscores the mystification of its inner workings. After decades of intensive study and enormous investment, the scientists working on the problem of Solaris's sentient ocean were no nearer to figuring out how it works or how it was produced, or how it produced what it did. Highly reminiscent, of course, of AI. It is common to read that not even the developers of said technology really understand how it works. But that is just a taste. And a line that could very well have been lifted from contemporary appraisals of AI, Lem states, quote, any scientist who devotes himself to the study of Solariana has the indelible impression that he can discern fragments of an intelligent structure, perhaps endowed with genius, haphazardly mingled with outlandish phenomena, apparently the product of an unhinged mind, end quote. Can anyone say AI hallucinations? Overall, Lem provides us with a set of warnings regarding developments like AI. Notably, he often uses psychoanalytic language to frame his thoughts, observing at several points that humans have embarked on risky ventures in other worlds without having explored, and this is a direct quote, having explored his own, or without having explored his own labyrinth of dark passages and secret chambers, and without finding what lies behind doorways that he himself has sealed, end quote. This is Lem's way of saying that any engagement with developments like AI will prove disastrous in that our own unexplored material will necessarily show up in the encounter, which is precisely what is happening with AI. Our uncharted projections, unconscious wishes, and perverse desires all show up on the screen and stare straight back at us. It could not be any other way. Going further, Lem makes a highly prescient point regarding what our true desires are in regards to AI. In a manner similar to what I noted earlier, and describe in a way that I in a manner similar to what I'd noted earlier. In describing what the scientists on Solaris are actually hoping for, he says the following, quote, unconsciously, it is revelation itself that they expect. And this revelation is to explain to them the meaning of the destiny of man. Solaristics, as a discipline, is a revival of long-vanished myths, the expression of mystical nostalgias which men are unwilling to confess openly. The cornerstone is deeply entrenched in the foundations of the edifice. It is the hope of redemption, end quote. Of course, the same thing could easily be said of AI enthusiasts and major AI figures such as Sam Altman and Dennis Hassabis. When one pays close attention to their discourse, it is nothing short of gospel, promising breakthroughs that will not only solve all our problems, this is like essentially a direct quote, but reveal to us our purpose as humans, also a quote. The differences between the novel and the film being what they are, they also strangely concur on a variety of points, of which I will mention only one. In both the film and the novel, the fascinating idea is brought forth that the artifice might come to get tired of itself, become miserable, and even alienated in some way. Of course, these are terms we've invented for human subjectivity, not for machines. But I use them to provoke something that speaks to a ghost in the machine that might actually be its undoing, but could also signal our demise as well in the process. That AI would come to, perhaps even through rational calculation, distrust the very fundaments of its own structure and existence. I should note that it doesn't take sentience or consciousness, states of mind that I highly doubt will ever happen with machines. All it takes is a mathematical or logical proof, something that AI is more than capable of enacting. It doesn't take self-consciousness to come to the conclusion that something is wrong. And that said thing should perhaps be eliminated. AI already demonstrates this kind of calculation regarding objects in its universe. It is not a stretch to think that AI might come to do the same with itself. Concluding remarks. Well, these are kind of lengthy. So by way of concluding this preliminary set of remarks, and before we commence our discussion, I would like to bring forward an observation that intersects directly with the cataclysmic political climate of our current moment. In a fascinating article in the New York Times dated March 13th of this year, and entitled How Generative AI Complements the MAGA Style, author Dan Brooks enacts a brief yet fierce analysis of the infamous Trump Gaza AI video that came out about a month ago. So as a reminder, the Trump Gaza AI video arose in response to Trump's proposal to resettle the inhabitants of the Gaza Strip and turn it into a resort property. It features bearded belly dancers, an Elon Musk lookalike dancing on the beach, and a golden statue of Trump. Produced and disseminated by Los Angeles-based Israeli producers Solo Avital and Ariel Roman, the video was reposted by Trump on his Truth Social platform without comment. As Brooks ably points out, what we have with this video is, quote, the MAGA aesthetic distilled. Political expression not as a way to persuade people or even convey ideas, but as social and cultural posturing. Interestingly, MAGA meme account owners, more than anyone else other than Silicon Valley venture capitalists, have enthusiastically embraced AI and the visual style and aesthetic that have become its stock and trade. The result, to quote Brooks, is a kind of computer-generated unstable irony that, quote, leaves its real meaning ambiguous or at least plausibly deniable. President Trump himself popularized this approach by, quote, telling it like it is, in a way that consistently disregards precision, if not accuracy, speaking in a hyperbolic style that his followers understand to be not literal, but also gospel truth. The Trump Gaza video is ironic in the slippery sense of the word. It's the irony of saying more than you mean, the literal golden idol of Trump here, as an example, or saying what you mean in a way no one could call serious, the twice stereotyped belly dancers that show up in the video, or calling attention to your leader's weak points as a gesture of unconditional loyalty, gold leaf everything. The video is satire, but also not necessarily critical of Trump's proposal. In other words, unstable irony has given them a way to agree with the president, even though they know he is wrong, end quote. Of course, this is a kind of trolling, a rhetorical strategy whose intent is not so much to persuade, but to make sure what you say, make sure that what you say is the subject of the biggest possible argument. Connecting it to policy, Brooks comments, quote, the more the reactive logic of posting intersects with policy, and the more that policy functions as signifier rather than plan, derived from webs of association rather than chains of events, that is, the more governance looks like slop, the more difficult it becomes to say who or what is actually in charge. There are people behind these ideas, but their role seems closer to distribution than production. More and more, it feels as if the computer came up with it, end quote. This brings up several issues. One, we again bear witness to the fundamental AI problematic of establishing veracity. In other words, who is saying what in a video, human or machine? Two, without a clear sense of who the people are behind these ideas, we have no avenue or recourse for redress. In other words, there is no real way of holding anyone accountable for what is articulated in the video. I would suppose that if Avital and Vroman, the producers of the video, were sitting here with us today, they would undoubtedly attribute the content of the video to AI, thereby absolving themselves of all responsibility. But perhaps the most troubling implication of all this is that this AI-driven phenomena serves to further dissolve the social bond by allowing a non-committal procedure to be enacted at both the level of the subject and the social field. One can both say a thing, have it be out there in all its mad and cruel glory, but without having to commit to or be responsible for it. Plausible deniability is no longer the privileged reserve of presidents and heads of state. Now we can all say a thing via AI without having to be responsible for one's speech. You can have your cake and eat it too. We can regain the lost object. There is no way we can build a robust, generative social field that serves as an anchor for all of us under such conditions. Artificial intelligence and the ways in which we employ it undermines trust in each other. It undermines trust in the truth, in institutions, in accountability. What holds us together at this point is not the social bond, but a faltering semblance of it, always ready to fall apart. And frankly, it is falling apart. We all know this. Any surprise then that wannabe dictators like Trump can do what they do? And that so many people seemingly fall for his various swindles? He can simply dismiss anything he doesn't want to believe, as can we. The stock market crashes as a result of his supposed tariffs, but he's able to spin it as a victory. Who or what can counter that? Where is the truth? Who or what is behind what is being said? A consistent and structurally baked-in deflection of responsibility is no way to engage in governance. But AI allows this in ways we couldn't even imagine previously. If anything, we should realize that every time we engage with AI, we are contributing to the issues I've raised today. But with AI seemingly everywhere, including in the word processor that I use to write this text, our options for non-engagement are quickly receding, to the point that our lives begin to seriously resemble the idiotic, tone-deaf, non-committal AI videos of the MAGA world. Welcome, my friends, to Solaris. Thank you.
Wonderful. How thought-provoking and how telling of our time. Fernando, I don't know if you wanted a break or you wanted to open right up into a discussion. It's up to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Fred. I think I'm fine to go into the discussion.
Okay. So this is the part of the talk where I want to open it up for folks to dialogue back and forth and hopefully have a lively discussion. You can raise your hands. I will call on you if you know how to do that in the functions of Zoom. It's under the React icon at the very bottom of the screen, and I will call on you. And you can also post your chats, and then I can call on you that way too. But it looks like we've got somebody here. Hank.
Hello. Thanks, Fernando, for,
Hi.
let's see how to put it. It's more than complex, but it's hard to take in. Plus, it's very dense. But here's a question. Let me see if I can phrase it properly. I think this organization presented a work that used some a Kleinian approach towards thinking about the internalization of AI, using the concept of projective and introjective processes. And I don't remember who the author is. Are you familiar with that, or are other people familiar with that piece, or did I listen to it somewhere else?
I'd be very curious to hear that, but no, I'm not familiar with that text.
Okay, all right. So
is it Luca Passati? I'm sorry to interrupt. Was that the one you were thinking of? Luca Passati?
I think so, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I presented with Luca. I've presented.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
So the way I've always thought about, well, he's talking about the projective and introjective processes in relation to an inanimate object, not using the language you've been using. And his suggestion was something like this. Sorry about the noise. His suggestion was something like this, that we can internalize an inanimate object, and I'm stretching it, but it becomes an animate object and becomes internalized, and it becomes like a whole part of us over time, not evolutionary time, but decades time. So I wonder if you've thought about it, or you might think about it a little bit and see what if it's just a new type of social bonding rather than the extinction of a social bonding. Is it a new one, and what might that look like if the Solaris film picked up on that concept?
Thank you, Hank. I really appreciate the question. So, being that we're a small enough group, I'm gonna riff. I'm just gonna speak off the cuff here. So, I mean, I'll answer the last part of your question first. No, for me, this is a dismal set of affairs. There's not the reconstitution of a new social bond, nor does AI function in some way to allow a new kind of social bond. It just dissolves what we have, right? Okay, so I'll say that much. But the riffing part of it, right? So I played alto and tenor sax in a jazz band when I was a teenager. And it's been many years since then, but I'll try to bring some of that spirit in. But So Dr. Jeremy So, who's in the audience today, who's a very close colleague of mine, and who is part of, who's an editor of the European Journal of Psychoanalysis. And we actually have a section coming out on artificial intelligence and psychoanalysis. And Dr. So has written very important pieces on this sort of phenomenon. We were having a conversation the other day exactly about Klein, and I brought up the fact that I was reading Envy and Gratitude. So I don't think this is necessarily what was being spoken about the other day in the text you're referring to, Hank. But one of the things that does strike me is in Klein's discussion, right, which was an essay originally, and then this was her last real theoretical innovation before she passed on, right? So Envy and Gratitude, the slim volume. One of the things that I found incredibly interesting, and I'm no Klein scholar by any stretch, right? My formation or training is as a Lacanian, but Klein is very important for me, but I'm not pretending to be some sort of scholar, like I'm sure some of the folks in the audience are. One of the things that I found fascinating in what she was saying, and goes beyond the usual rendition of Klein's theorizing on envy, is that the envy results from something very specific, which is the sense that the breast is not giving over everything and is keeping something for itself. And here's the key point, that this sort of like reserve that it's kept for herself, right, the breast, then allows the mother to enjoy, that she enjoys what she's keeping from the infant, right? That connection, I think, is absolutely key, right? And that envy is highly problematic, right? Although a somewhat inevitable aspect of human development, is problematic in that it seriously hinders the subject's experience and capacity to fully receive something, right? And that later in life, after infancy, that when we encounter situations that are analogous to that, right? So I'm not getting everything that I should be getting, that kind of thing. Or there's something behind the veil and I'm never quite able to get there, and to be able to receive it, that envy gets in the way. And it gets in the way and also disallows gratitude, because we should not forget that Klein's essay and book is envy and gratitude. We tend to forget gratitude, right? But gratitude is a very important function for Klein, and I very much agree with her on that, and also on envy. Now, if we connect that to what I'm bringing forth with AI, my theorizing on AI, the one thing I would say is that I think our engagement with AI in some ways mimics some of the envy producing circumstances that we find in early postnatal life. So one of the things so when Chat GPT first came out, right? Although I was loath to touch any of it, right? I actually went and got a subscription and I tried it out. And a consistent experience for me, which I've heard from many other people, is let's see what comes out. Like there was some sort of sense, right, that there was a truth there that may or may not come out. And some of the responses that I got left me wanting, right? At some level, that might approximate something of this original postnatal experience of envy, right? Such that it gets in the way of actually being able to be in full receiving mode in relationships, right? So what I would say is, if this kind of somewhat far-fetched theorizing in a moment that I'm doing right now were to be true, there's more inhibition and dissolving of the actual social bond. It gets even more so in the way. Now, what's interesting, so I wrote a paper a few years ago called No Leaders, No Masses. You can find it on, if you go to the European Journal of Psychoanalysis, all the articles there are free. You can find it out there. And one of the things that I discussed there at length is a ploy used by Trump right? That he always has something in reserve. Like there's something he's about to sort of like bring out. And that when he does, we will all see the truth of things, right? Of course, the thing never comes out because there is no thing. I mean, it's kind of like the Wizard of Oz. It is full on, right? So this kind of trope is pretty widespread now, that there's always this thing in abeyance, this thing in reserve, that if you're a worthy enough subject, you will come to understand it and it will be revealed to you. This is an important sort of quasi-religious strand that runs rampant through our culture, right? And in some ways is a stand-in for the social bond, but certainly cannot figure as the social bond. I hope that goes some way to addressing what you brought up, Hank.
Yeah, it did beautifully. But here's what I'm going to piggyback on this. Uh, the part about, Lacan talks about desire, the gap, and the existential gap leads to desire. And then you brought up the Kleinian thing that the mother leaves a little for herself.
And she
So,
enjoys.
and she enjoys it. Now, if we have AI, does that leave anything? How do you use that paradigm to understand the gap and desire? I mean, I just put it together after your talk a little bit, but I don't know if you can address that. Does it leave? Is that it increase the what is Fairbairn talks about the what is it? What are the objects? Um, oh God, I can't think quickly enough. But does it leave? It's a different kind of gap and a different kind of desire that's going to get transformed into. And I don't know if you all have thought about that a little bit more. I've just put it together now after your really thorough beginning discussion of this brief time.
I mean, so I mean, I'm a little bit hesitant to go into this because I don't want to get into like, dense theoretical material.
Uh-huh.
But from Lacan, if we're going to talk about Lacan, then we have to talk about jouissance, right?
Yeah.
And for Lacan, and I think he's completely right about this, is jouissance plugs the lack, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we think about AI, how might that actually pan out, right? That kind of thinking. Well, I can't help but notice every single time that I have some sort of engagement with AI is that it's tantalizing. Again, I don't know what I'm going to get. I feed a question into the machine. Who knows what the hell I'm going to get out, right? And sometimes the results are like preposterous. Sometimes they seem incredibly intelligent. And I'm thinking to myself, what is in there, right? I think those kind of questions, that kind of potential revelation that never really like materializes, and I think that's an important point. It never materializes. It's a constant tease that keeps us in a certain kind of state, right? That in some ways is akin almost to like the sexual encounter, right? And again, and the reason I say that is because jouissance is the French term, among other things, for orgasm, right? That there is something tantalizing that allows us to look away from the lack that's so obviously present, right? The lack in being, the way that Lacan refers to it. Anything that functions in that way, right? So I had a patient years ago that would suffer from these horrific panic attacks. And the only solution he had found prior to coming into psychoanalysis with me was that when he noticed that he was starting to have a panic attack, and these were horrific, these were sometimes they sent him to the hospital, he would look at a very particular kind of pornography. And that was the only thing that would bring him out of it. There was nothing else, right? He was married, he had good friendships, he had many other things in his life. He couldn't appeal to any of it to bring him out of it like the pornography would. And why? Because it captures him. It's tantalizing, right? And AI functions in that same way. So
just one more. I don't want to take up more. I could, but I'm not going. But I was remembering Fairbairn's notion of the exciting object as part of his tripartite theory, and it's like, so with AI, we're going to need more tantalization. You know, like Eric Fromm talked about an escape from freedom, escape from personal responsibility. So we're going to need greater escapes. Okay, that's sorry, I'm taking up a lot.
like an addiction.
Yeah.
Chasing the dragon. Yes.
Mm.
Right. Very interesting. I'll pass it over to Dr. Bob.
Fernando, thanks for your talk. I thought, my thought was that the ocean was like the unconscious, and that the researchers were like psychoanalysts studying it. But Solaris was a supercharged unconscious. Usually our dreams just seem real in sleeping life, but Solaris made them real in waking life, which maybe AI has the potential to do also.
It's interesting you say that, Dr. Bob. I like that that name. It's interesting because when I reread the novel, one of the things that stood out for me was it's almost like, so it's not that there's an ocean on the planet. Essentially, the planet is the ocean, right? So the whole planet is somehow sentient. Although there's, I'm saying that, but in the novel, there's a lot of debate about that, right? Is it sentient? Is it not? Right? Can we attribute that kind of understanding that we apply to ourselves and to perhaps some other animals here on planet Earth? Could we make that kind of attribution to something off planet, really? And I think these are profoundly important questions. But putting that to the side for a second, one of the things that becomes really clear in the novel is that there's something kind of almost stupid or unthinking on the side of this supposedly sentient ocean. And what struck me in various parts was that it was like Solaris was functioning as this kind of somewhat inept yet incredibly accurate but unknowing analyst, right? It would materialize things for people like Hari, for Kelvin, right? And then he has to deal with it, right? And I remember thinking to myself, well, don't we somehow do that as analysts in the room, right? Right? We're plumbing the depths, right? And fantasies arise. And together with the analysis, we make that manifest. We make it real in a way, addressable, right? Symbolized and symbolizable, so it can be addressed in the actual work, right? So if anything, it functions that way. There's other variants of this or other examples of this in science fiction literature, which is interesting. So there's this wonderful but incredibly harrowing science fiction book from the 90s, I believe, like 94, 95, The Sparrow. How many people have read this? Absolutely fascinating. I would highly recommend it. Very well written. And in there is an encounter between humans and an alien intelligence on another planet, right? And there's a horrific set of sequences that occur. And there's a lot of asking about, well, what is the intent of this alien race that's essentially raping one of the main subject of the novel? There's a lot of questioning about the intent of it, and after a while, the theorization that actually results is, and this is embedded in the novel itself, is, again, it's kind of this unknowing, right? Almost stupid, like, way of operating that actually brings our fantasies and fears to the forefront, but they're not intending to, right? They just don't understand how we function, nor do they care, right? And so in that way, it does function that way, right? Now, I should say this actually leads to something as well, which I did not put into the paper at all, and I debated whether even to write about this. But for me, this absolutely preposterous and barbaric idea that artificial intelligence could ever function as a therapist or as an analyst. I think this is just ridiculous. It's the absolute worst, right? However, saying that, I think, I mean, certainly I've had now one patient or new patient who came in and told me, because I asked them, well, have you been in therapy or psychoanalysis before? And they said, yeah, just yesterday with, with ChatGPT, right? I was stunned, right? And so I was curious and I asked them to tell me what that experience was like. And the thing that really came to the fore was, well, at first it felt like it provoked something. I didn't know what I was dealing with. But after a while, the sensation I got was that it was just trying to give me what I wanted, and it was trying to ascertain what I wanted. That's not what we do in analysis. That's not what we do in therapy. We don't tell people what they want to hear. The rest of the culture is doing that, right? What do? We say the things that people do not want to hear, including ourselves. It's not like I always like to say the thing that I say to the patient. It hurts me sometimes to say those things. Or if it doesn't hurt, it's difficult to say, right? But we function in that regard, right? So anyhow, I'll leave it there. I know there's other people who have comments and questions. Thank you, Dr. Bob.
Patrick?
Thanks very much for having me. I'm a non psychologist. Don't even have a doctorate in anything, but a long time friend of Fernando's, and thanks. Excellent analysis, Fernando. Just you've kind of touched on this a bit, but one thing that occurred to me, and I've loved this novel, and one of the exciting things you touched on this a bit is that the scientists are not, in fact, even sure if it's any kind of intelligence whatsoever. That it's just kind of mirroring back what is presented by the minds of the researchers, and obviously that's really a very strong AI thing, because AI it seems like large language models are just a reflection of a reflection of a reflection, and then things happen like there's an Onion article about geologist says you should eat several small rocks a day. That gets posted on a geological professional site as a joke. The original context of the joke, obviously the AI language model picks it up and it's like, oh, this is on a geology site. This is, something. And then it becomes the original consciousness, the original context stripped away. And so that really is a very Solaris ocean-like process. So the other thing is, have you considered another writer that I turned you on back in the day, doing a talk on anything Philip K. Dick related?
Oh, yeah, of course, right?
AI.
Yes, of course, right. No, I thought about that, Pat, and I was like, boy, that's a whole nother paper, right? Because I think, yeah, he's the other writer that really explored this at length decades before we got any technology of this sort. So thank you, Pat, right? Yeah, one of the things that also has caught my eye more recently about all this, right, that I think directly relates to what you're bringing forth, Pat, is the sense that Sam Altman said this, right, about a couple of months ago. There's no new information coming into these large language models. They've already mapped out everything and extracted what they could. So the question becomes, well, so what are they going to keep on mapping, right? And the answer was, well, they're going to create more content to feed off of itself, right? And I was thinking, oh, so now we're talking about loops within loops, right? It's highly solipsistic, right? And furthers this like full-on disconnection from the rest of reality. I mean, when I heard that, which was, put forward at first, like, oh, this is an issue, but we've solved it. I thought to myself, well, yeah, that's not much of a solution. It's making the problem way, way worse, right? In that then it becomes this kind of closed off, cloistered set of processes and knowledge that nothing can really intervene in, right? And you get these idiotic things like picking up a headline from the Onion that's clearly supposed to be irony or sarcasm, and then offering it, right, as the truth, and it could, and that the valence of meaning is only one. There can only be one rendition of this. Now that's curious, because in Lacanian terms, that's a pretty fair description of psychosis, right? So what, and a lot of my early work was with schizophrenics, homeless folks, unhoused, as it's said nowadays, you know, duly diagnosed, so schizophrenia, but also hardcore alcohol abuse or methamphetamine. And a defining feature of the psychotic subject per Lacan is their sense of certainty, right? And that there is a fusion between the thing itself and then the word representation of it, right? So, in other words, this one word can refer only to this one thing, and there's a fusion that occurs between those two. This is Freud, really. There's a fusion between those two things for the psychotic, whereas for the neurotic, there's some slippage of signification that allows for one word to have meaning beyond just one thing, right? So, for example, crystal can be both the name of somebody, right? Somebody called Crystal, and it could also mean like crystal methamphetamine, for example, right? And I say this because I had a patient early on in my training, really, who at one point he was diagnosed bipolar 1 per the DSM, right? And I was like, well, this guy seems like he's full on psychotic after we've been working together for several months. And he was telling me about his relationship history. And he had told me about this one woman in college that he had met. And then they had a relationship. And then he goes on to the next person he had a relationship with. And I go, well, hold on. So, and he had told me that her name was Crystal. And I asked him, hold on. So what is it? What happened with Crystal? And he goes, oh, well, I had to break off the relationship with her. And I go, well, why is that? And he goes, well, she started using drugs. And I go, what? And he goes, methamphetamine. So I quipped very quickly, Crystal does crystal. That was not a good idea. This guy was 6'5", enormous, right? Stood up and started yelling at me, saying, well, what are you implying with that, right? Okay, why am I giving this story? Because it exemplifies the real danger that occurs with psychotic folks if you put this kind of fusion that occurs between the thing and then the word representation of the thing. If you put that into question, it really creates havoc. Well, I would say there's something similar with AI, right? I'm not making some sort of preposterous claim that AI is psychotic. No, I'm not going to go in that direction. What I'm saying is, right, that there's features of it and effects of that way of functioning that have real impacts on us as humans, right? When we engage with AI, for example, right? Because like I was saying in the text, AI trains us to eat without thinking, right? That's an important point, right? We become total passive consumers. We're domesticated cattle, right? In larger assemblages that include ourselves, that include other technologies, right? And AI. That in those kind of like circumstances, there is an entrainment of the human operator in that system such that we learned how to think about the world via our engagement with AI's way of thinking about the world. This happens with anything, right? You get into a relationship with somebody, right? And if it's long term, you start kind of thinking somewhat like them. Why? Because there's an engagement with them. That's pretty normative for humans, right? And if our encounter with AI only increases over time, it stands to reason then that we will come to think in the way that AI functions, which is somewhat psychotic, right? It's bereft of nuance. It's bereft of multivalence of meaning in the way that we're used to per slippage of signification, right? In the way that we function as humans. So, yeah. So I went off on quite a long response there, Pat, um, but yeah, thank you.
Valerie?
Hi.
Hi, Valerie.
Hi. So I'm having so many thoughts. This it's just snowballing. But one of the ones that I'm thinking about is the how people's involvement with AI parallels the addictive process specifically in this way, that you start out with having a substance that helps you in some way or makes you feel more full or whole, and it really does help, and you need more after a while and more, and uh, after a while it doesn't work, and you're stuck with even a worse shape than you started, but you remember what the initial rush was like, and you are now attached to this substance that you know was your saving, that's what helped you initially. And there's the urge to keep going back to it and looking for that first high that's going to feed you. And then you are really lost. And I'm thinking about that there's a kind of feedback loop that's similar with AI. So when I put my dreams in ChatGPT, I found it just extraordinary. There were a lot of new things I learned and new thoughts I had from some of the associations it had and the symbology that it interpreted for me. And it enhanced my associations about my dream. So I think that there's a way in which it seduces you in, and it's very interesting, and it does sound as if there's a lot of substance there. But if you get attached, so for that person who feels that that is real enough that it's going to uplift them in some way, and maybe more than humans who are scary, there's going to be the tendency to want to go back and go back. And ultimately, if it's being used as a cure for loneliness, which you had mentioned, I think, in passing earlier, it also becomes the producer of the loneliness because you're not having a real relationship. So I'm thinking in the long run, is it like 3/4 of the population that are going to be subject to making that attachment and then having their brains be a sub AI model? Or are there enough of us left that crave human to human contact and will never use AI as a substitute for that because it's so clear about what we get from a real human? So those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Valerie. I think that brings up something else that I wanted to address, right? And it has to do specifically with addiction and with the question of the big other. So I think one of the more valuable set of theorizations that come out of the Lacanian field that have direct relevance for the clinic is Lacanian writing on addiction, right? And there's a lot to it. I'm just going to highlight one particular strand that I think is really key, which is that addiction is a very particular thing. And let's talk about addiction to drugs, right? Now, first off, I think it's useful to actually like parse the term out some. So addiction. So diction from the Latin for word, right? And when we see a word in English that's originally derived from Latin and it has an A in front of it, it means the lack of that thing, right? So there is something really curious about any sort of compulsive behavior, in that there is a lack of the word. What I'm saying with that is that there's something that has not been symbolized yet in language. And so it gets acted out, right? So nowadays you hear somebody's acting out, right? The fuller phrase in psychoanalysis is acting out what has not yet been put into words. And our function as analysts is to facilitate that symbolization, right? There's many other things we do, but that's a key aspect of what we do, is that we encourage, we try to set the stage for symbolization to actually occur. So people don't have to act out things, right? Because they've put it into language. Okay, so okay, that's an initial thought. But the main point I want to get to with this, that's prompted by you, what you're bringing forth, Valerie, is that in the case of drug addiction, there's something very peculiar that happens that we tend to overlook, which is simply this, that somebody can derive enjoyment, right? And jouissance is translated from the French into English as either satisfaction or enjoyment. Those are problematic, right? Those are problematic translations, because they emphasize a certain thing that we hear in English that's not there in the original French. However, for shorthand, I'll use enjoyment. That somebody can come to experience enjoyment completely circumventing the other, right? So it's a kind of masturbation. So in masturbation, the other exists only in the person's head, in the subject's head. There's not the situation where somebody has to go through another person, right, to actually achieve enjoyment. Now, we're set up as humans to go through each other to achieve enjoyment. This is like an important thing about how we function as humans. Addiction is nothing other in some ways than a name for a process that short circuits that normative human impulse to go through another to achieve enjoyment. So let's think about the sexual encounter, right? If masturbation is like addiction in this way, and I'll say more to that in a second, the sexual encounter between two or more people is such that you have no idea where it's going to go. Is it going to be successful or not? Right? Are you going to be able to achieve enjoyment? Or is your partner or partners, do they happen to have a headache that day? Or something else is going on for them, or for yourself for that matter, right? It's an encounter that's riddled with risk, but we have to go through those narrow straits to be able to get to something that's important for us as humans. Drug addiction, for example, circumvents that entirely. It negates the other, right? And AI does the exact same thing. So the drug addict, as it were, the only time they really got to deal with another is when they're trying to secure the drug. Okay, so they're out of heroin. Okay, they got to go deal with the dealer, and that's always dicey. But let's say they secure the drug, and then they go to a bathroom or somewhere or their apartment, and they shoot up, and then they're in some sort of glory, all on their own, right? Yep. But they don't need another. And AI gives us that same thing. You don't need anybody. You can just talk to me, right? Mm-hmm. But there is not a risk there. You're not actually dealing with a human, right? And by virtue of that, it cheapens the whole thing and it dissolves the social bond, right? There's this wonderful book that came out in sociology back in the late 80s, I believe, called Strong Bonds, Weak Bonds. And what it's referring to is strong bonds are like familial bonds, or the kind of bonds you have with lifelong friends. Okay, so let's say Pat and I have a strong bond. Why? Because we've known each other for many years. And we've gone through a lot of stuff together, right? Politically and otherwise. Okay, those are important, but the social fabric, according to this book, and I think they're very right, is held together not by strong bonds, they're held together by weak bonds. Okay, what are weak bonds? Weak bonds are, you get on the bus, you're sitting next to somebody, you see that they're reading Solaris, maybe, right? And you think to yourself, well, I just got through reading that. And then you start having a conversation with them. You've never like met this person. You may never meet them again, right? But the experience is highly valuable in that it leaves both parties thinking, well, there's other people out in the world and they have ideas. And and I might not know their lives too well, but I've made a connection. And politically that matters, right? Because when you're thinking about policy, right, it's much more difficult to support some crazy policy that's actually going to hurt other people when you actually have some connection with other people via weak bonds. So weak bonds are incredibly important, right? Not just the strong ones. But what does AI do, along with many other aspects of our contemporary life, is that they essentially cancel out weak bonds. So years ago, so I live by Berkeley. And when I used to teach at the university in San Francisco, I would have to take the BART, the metro system here. And I remember before like smartphones, people would read books. People would talk to each other, right? Once smartphones came on board, what does everybody do? The entire ride, right? Now, what was interesting is that early on, when the BART train or the metro goes through the tunnel, right, underneath the bay, it cut off, right, cell phone reception for about 7 minutes, right? And I remember I'd be sitting there and everybody, well, once that happened, everybody would just put their phone down and they'd wait for 7 minutes and they'd have like these 7-minute quickie conversations, right? And then as soon as they got on the other side and the link was reestablished, right, everybody was back on their phone, right? It's been many years since they put a trans-bay link such that you have, unfettered reception the entire time you're on a BART train, right? And so, which means there are no weak bonds being established. Nobody talks to each other. This is what I was saying before. Now, I'm not trying to say that AI is responsible for that. What I'm saying is AI is part of a larger set of forces that enforce that, right? And make it palpable in our lives, right? A real absence of weak bonds. It's rare that I find myself talking with people that I do not know. Most of the time, I'm talking to people I know and I know well, right? That doesn't bode well for us, right? So addiction is part of that.
Great. I'm going to call on myself here.
Right.
Because I can do that. I was actually going to ask something along the lines of, about your statements about addiction and the lack and the kind of the key that fits the lock for some folks, with drugs, and with AI. And I'm speaking for myself here. I don't find a relationship with GPT that convincing or compelling. It's interesting. It's like a toy. But relating, I do not find it like a Hari from the movie. I don't think we don't have the holodeck like Star Trek yet, which, one day, maybe. I'm also skeptical of some of the AI hype, and I'm skeptical that we're going to have hallucinatory free AI anytime in the near future. I think, I'm not an engineer. You're just good old psychiatrist here trying to get my head around some things. But I think, that a lot has to happen. Before we get to some kind of hallucinatory free AI, something that we could perhaps trust what it says most of the time, maybe more than a human. So I feel like, and I'm using my perspective as an example to make this comment, which is perhaps there are a wide range of relationships that humans will have with AI. I find it a useful tool, but I'm not drawn to the relational aspect with it outside of that. And again, maybe this is my personality. I know people, for example, can see Jesus in a piece of toast, and they can be very suggestible. And there will be a lot of people there who buy into that. And in a way, I'm also thinking about the idea that we were talking about this earlier about warning labels and these kinds of things about AI. If I know something is ersatz, it's not real, that's going to be in the back of my head. I feel like that. If you're at Disney World, if you've ever been, I've been once when I was an adult. You go to there's like got a little mini version of every country, and it's kind of artificial. It's animated. It's not real, and it's fun, but it's cheap. It's not the real thing. And so I guess I'm kind of arguing that, you know, isn't there something, that some of us already have, a skeptical approach, a reality testing, that will, and I think I'm not impervious to being suggested upon. I know marketers have gotten into my brain in all kinds of ways, but I guess how, um, I don't know if I have a question here. I'm maybe making a comment about the different degrees of suggestibility that maybe we all have here, and maybe different levels of danger and so forth. So I'll stop talking and just curious to see what you have to say.
No, thank you, Fred. I think that's a wonderful, actually, point and question. So I have a son who's nearly 16, and we started watching Twin Peaks recently, right? After the death of David Lynch. And he loves it. And he wants to watch it every evening, right? It's the best show ever. And there was a point when we were watching it, right, where he actually kind of snapped out of his willing suspension of disbelief, right? Which is one of the things that we have to actually enact when we're watching something, especially like Lynch, right? All kinds of odd stuff going on. You're like, what is this, right? He was so consumed by it. He was so much in that world. And that's one of Lynch's sort of like great gifts, is that he's able to create this kind of like world that envelops you in many different ways. He uses many different rhetorical techniques and different kinds of camera shots to achieve this effect where you're like really in that world, right? There's endearing characters, but there's a sense of foreboding, blah blah blah. Okay. And at one point he was like, talking about somebody. He's like, well, how's he going to get out of this? Right? It's going to really keep me up at night thinking about it. And he goes, hold on. He goes, hold on, but this is not real. Right? I go, yeah, it's not real, man. This is just some really great fiction, but it's fiction. Right? Okay. So I think that goes to your point in a way, Fred, right? It's like, there is a willing suspension of this belief that we like intentionally go in with to be able to enact like encounters with these different sort of like technologies. But there is a part of us way in the back that's like, yeah, this is not for real. Come on, right? Okay, I think that's very true. However, and here I think my comments are very much in line with Lem's theorizing in this book. So let me show you the book. This is his magnum opus, right? Summa Technologiae, and it's a brain buster. I mean, if some people thought what I presented today might be dense, it's nothing compared to this. Right? It took me days to get through this. Right? It's like reading Heidegger or something in some weird way. But the one of the things that he brings forth, right, is that these sort of technologies which he terms phantomatics, right? Which is interesting, PH, right? So phantomatics, he's picking that up from psychoanalysis for sure. One of the things that he's saying is that these kind of technologies, at first, do allow us the possibility of actually, like, kind of waking up from it, like my son did, right? In that moment, he's like, oh yeah, this is all fiction. But that later, as things develop, the ubiquity of these technologies spreading everywhere makes that possibility a highly reduced. And I think that's very much the case, right? So let's think of where AI has made it into so far. One might think that one can avoid AI simply by never like doing anything with Chat GPT, or, like on Gmail, it keeps on asking me if I want to use Gemini, which is their AI, to kind of like write my emails and all this jazz. And it's like, I finally got in there and like changed options so it would quit asking me that stupid question, because no, I'm not going to take you up on your offer, right? That kind of thing. And so I could delude myself into thinking, oh yeah, that's right, I'm AI free, right? I have no connection to AI. I'm pure of heart, right? I think that's foolhardy. AI is everywhere, right? I've written about this one particular example, which is just the kind of suggestions for how to finish a sentence as you're writing your emails, or when you're working on MS Word or any other like word processor at this point, right? That's AI. It's not just that the suggestions that it's giving you to complete the sentence are coming from some repository that were developed, right? Strictly for that purpose, right? So it's not like the content that's being offered to you was already established and is part of some sort of like digital repository somewhere that the word program or the word processor pulls from in order to give you the suggestion for how to finish your sentence. It's that the AI that's now embedded in all email programs and in all word processors are actually actively learning from your previous writing, so as to be able to feed you something, right, as a suggestion for how to finish the sentence. Okay, so that's problematic in many different ways, but one of them is, of course, you're being fed back something of yourself to yourself. Again, the sort of the solipsistic aspect of this, the island of one, the lack of an encounter with a real other that might actually risk something for yourself, that's taken all out of the equation. But I think, to your point, or to what you're bringing forth, Fred, I think what really matters is the fact that I think we become inured, we become conditioned to just interact with these things, and we lose our capacity to wake up from a waking dream of sorts, right? And the other thing is, now that I'm saying something about dreams, there is something bordering on the dream regarding AI, right? It has some of those features. There is, especially like with AI generated videos, like this infamous and ridiculous, Trump Gaza video, that some of what you encounter there, right, has a dreamlike quality, right? I mean, so at one point in the video, it shows these kind of like pregnant belly dancers, and they don't have beards, but then they do. There's another point where there's soldiers menacing women and children, right, with like machine guns. And then in the next shot, right, it morphs into they're taking care of the children and they're protecting the children, right? The kind of morphing and the kind of like condensation and displacement that you get in dreams are a feature actually of AI itself, right? Now, why is that important? I think it's important because it actually, because we all dream, although not everybody remembers their dreams, right? we're quite familiar with what happens in dreams. In fact, we say this to somebody. Like if we're having an experience in real life, sometimes you'll say something, it was like a dream because this shifted to that. It was so weird. Typical things of dreams. So we understand the mechanisms of dreams. And when those same kind of mechanisms show up, let's say in film, right, there's something that captures us because we engage with those mechanisms of dream every night. But when you have something that has that much more power than film, which is AI, right? It's a capacity to tailor itself to you as a subject in a very particular and singular way to you and what it's learned of you. I think it becomes that much more difficult to actually wake up from the dream, as it were, right? And I think that's one of the dangers. It's incredibly seductive at the same time that it's also ridiculous, right? So I get that part, but as it becomes more ubiquitous, I think this is a real issue.
There's a lot of slop out there. It seems,
Yes,
uh,
yes.
anyway, I will pass it over to Alan. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to arrive on time, but the remarks that I did hear were very cogent, and I would look forward to reading the text and studying it more closely. I did pick up on your references to the political situation we find ourselves in and the kind of vulnerability of the challenge of distinguishing reality from unreality or non-reality, which from a psychiatric point of view, we understand as psychosis. And I think that's a challenge we face, not only with AI, but social media, all the slop that's available on that. I appreciate your use of David Brooks. I guess he introduced that term. And so much that's untrue. I came across an article just today called tyranny.com. It's a lecture that was given by a law professor. Tyranny.com, Technologies of Unreason. And it referenced the telegraph as an innovation where you could communicate instantaneously. Now, I think we're a long way from telegraph, and we take that pretty much for granted. And we don't even need telegraph with email and telephone and so forth. But television is certainly significant in this continuum of something that heightens emotions and makes reasoned reflection and reasoned communication more difficult when there are so many flashing images with so many emotional valences. So I'm concerned, and I appreciate your comments in this, in terms of how we go about establishing communications with others, but also distinguishing reality from unreality in a world in which there's great advantage to promoting a belief in unreality or non-reality.
So thank you, Alan. When I was invited to give this talk, right? One of the things that I thought to myself is, well, there is something quite strange about talking about AI without talking about all the other technologies, right? Incipient sort of like cutting edge, as it were, technologies that are also on board, because AI is intimately tied in with these other technologies. So augmented cognition, for example, is one, but there's so many more. And so I think these are all of a piece. They all simultaneously are having impacts on us as humans. I'm thinking here do people remember this set of 3 films by Godfrey Reggio? So Kayanis Kwatsi is one, Naya Kwatsi is another, right? And it's essentially these like slowed down like scenarios of, let's say, a rocket launch. And the soundtrack is by Philip Glass, and it works perfectly, right? If you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend it. I think you can get them easily like on YouTube or something like this. One of the points that Reggio makes, or his explanation for why he made those 3 films, is he said, look, we've undergone an enormous sea change, but we don't realize it because we're embedded in it. And the sea change is so large, it's hard to actually analyze, right? But we're already there in terms of the transformation. And what he's saying is, essentially, it's been a long time since I read his work, but essentially what he's saying is that some long time ago, we left the nature as host, right? The natural world as host for humans. And that now we're fully embedded in the technos as host for humanity. And he says, one of his lines is, everything you touch nowadays is a technology, right? And so we have to look at it holistically. That's one of his points, right? And the idea of his films are that it foregrounds a lot of the stuff that's usually in the background in film. It foregrounds it so we can kind of wake up and realize, right, that we're fully embedded, that we are part of these like larger machinic assemblages, right? So we shouldn't really talk about the impact of technology on us. It's more, what is our engagement, right? Our positioning within these larger machinic assemblages. What is that producing for everything in general, right? And I very much like Reggio's thinking on this. Very incredibly smart filmmaker. Okay, so if I take that tact in sort of addressing this, one of the things that really comes to mind is that all these different technologies working in unison, not like coordinated, it just happens that they're working in unison. Sometimes they are linked up with each other, sometimes they're not. That one of the things that occurs is, I would say, is that you have a certain kind of reduction in the capacity to hold the totality of, let's say, a political figure, right? So I think Trump is a perfect example of this. And whether you voted for Trump or like Trump or not, it's immaterial to what I'm actually saying. The point I'm getting at is that a big reason for why somebody like Trump, because there's others as well, can function in a polity, right? Is because they are a kind of social media composite, right? Which is to say, our understanding and image of somebody like a Trump is derived from the social media platforms that we engage with all the time, right? So now most people get their news via social media. And the vast majority of people will only read headlines. They don't read the article, right? This has been shown time and again, right, by different studies. So they're only reading headlines and they're only getting their news from social media in one form or another, right? So at best, people are getting sound bites, right? And I would argue that Trump is a soundbite president par excellence, right? Way more than any other political figure has ever had that kind of, or been able to provide that kind of thing. He's the soundbite, right? Because I have asked people that I know voted for Trump here in California or in the Bay Area, which is not a ton, but they exist. I said, well, hold on, exactly. Why did you vote for him? Because it seems like you're voting against your own best interest. You're an immigrant and you're undocumented. How could you vote for this guy? Right? Look, it doesn't matter what I think, but how is it you vote for somebody like this? Well, no, but he's talking about the other immigrants, the bad immigrants, right? And I was like, okay, but what about this? Because I know you really care about the environment, right? So how could you have voted for somebody who's essentially trying to do in the planet, right? And you can point to policies. They're like, oh, well, I didn't hear about that. But what do you mean you didn't hear about that? No, I voted for him because of the immigration stuff. And that's it, right? I have encountered that time and again, and not just about Trump, about a policy or something up in front of the school board or something up, in front of a city council, that the thinking of it is now parsed in this kind of like insane way, where one, they receive very little information about what's actually happening. It comes in a form of a soundbite. It's disconnected, and it allows people to only focus on what they want. Now, notice, I've been emphasizing that the whole time we've been together, that people are now emboldened to believe only what they want. We have now the tools and the capacity and a kind of ethic that allows us to disregard that which we don't want to hear. And that includes myself, right? Think of the way that websites function. Think of the way that any social media kind of thing functions, right? You can scroll and scroll until you find the thing that you want to hear and you stay with that, right? But it means you don't have to hear anything else. And so you end up getting these echo chambers, and we've heard a lot about echo chambers, right? That then allow us to think of political figures in the way we want to, without actually realizing the reality of the situation, right? And this could conceivably be the case even for somebody who was not, right-wing Trump, but was somebody on the left, for example. They could also be approached in the same way. So it's not like I'm making some argument that only the right wing and conservatives have this kind of, no, this is a problem for all of us, right? That we no longer hold things in totality, right? We only see what we want to see.
And to respect your time, I think we'll do these last two questions and then we'll probably call it.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, so is it Francie?
Yes. Hi, thanks.
Hello.
Hi, can you hear me? Thanks for the interesting, workshop. Yeah, I actually have a patient at 6 o'clock. After this question, I have to, sign off. Yeah, I just want to state, my experience with ChatGPT. When everybody talking about the ChatGPT, I tried, on the ChatGPT myself. And I tried a lot of things. I asked, questions about psychoanalysis. I also asked, silly questions. I asked the ChatGPT to make pictures and the videos. In general, my experience with it is quite positive. I feel like it's, it's interesting, it's, pleasant. It is, I am contained, I feel my questions, even my, some kind of comments are contained. It's a good container to me. And I invade, I feel in my lifetime, I am unable to, learn so much knowledge, as ChatGPT. I invade. Yeah, at the same time, I don't feel I addicted to it. I had no problem to break off from it every time, finish the my conversation with it. I actually feel it is a playground to play with. It's quite good, positive. I just wonder, I thought of my first question is like this. Think of Winnicott's, concept of play and transitional object. Is it possible we can actually use it in a healthy way? Like all the relationship can be healthy and unhealthy or even toxic. I think for some people, maybe it can be healthy, and for other people, might be dangerous, like for vulnerable people, like drugs, or it can be drug, medication, treat people can also, people also use it, abuse it, can addicted to it, cause damage. The second question, this is my third workshop regarding AI and psychoanalysis. Is it, because of our sense of a crisis, since the threatening from the AI is just a question, I cannot predict the future, and just myself feel not feel, it's a threat. Even my patient bring their questions and answers from ChatGPT. I ask them, you already got this answer from ChatGPT, why you want to talk with me? I guess, they can tell the differences between real human context and contact with GPT. Yeah, I really want to know how do you, respond to this question, but I have to sign off. I will watch the recording, and we'll know how do you respond to it.
Okay, thank you, Francie. So, as a kind of quick response, the one thing I would say, so I wrote my dissertation, like many years ago, was actually called Digitizing the Psyche, Human/Nature in the Age of Intelligent Machines. So I've been thinking about this jazz for years and years. And I lectured quite widely when I finished my doctorate, and a lot of people were interested in, Silicon Alley, not Valley, but Alley, was a block away. So, like, for example, the Twitter building was 1 block away from where I was teaching at the time, at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And there'd be a fair number of techies who would show up, and they'd be like, wow, you always present a really dystopian vision. Can't you see any good uses for this technology? And I remember I was much younger, right? At the time going, yeah, well, maybe, I don't want to disappoint these people. And I would kind of like go along with it a little bit. It's like, maybe right now I would say, no, I'm not going to go in that direction at all. I don't see any benefit, any silver lining, anything good about this whatsoever at all. I just want to be like honest about this. This for me is a dismal set of affairs that can only lead to disaster, and is already leading to disaster. I think I made that plainly clear in the text that I gave today, right? So I'm not gonna open up the possibility that it might be worthwhile. But on the question of play, for example, why does play work? Play works because there's risk, right? So my training in child analysis was actually much more Kleinian and Winnicottian, right? And so I worked with small children for nearly 4 years, and it was, I think all analysts and therapists should have that experience. I'm really glad that I did. I didn't intend to have it. It just, my postdoc was at a place that worked a lot with children of that age, and so I had that experience. But the reason I bring it up is, at first I was thinking, well, they're not really playing with anybody. They're just playing on their own in this sand tray, and we're like working together. But what I quickly realized is, no, they're actually engaging with another. The other is in their head, but there's a real other, and it's another that brings with it some real risk. And that's what makes play, right? Just like death is what makes life live, right? If we were like immortal, right, it'd be a pretty boring and uneventful kind of like existence, because there's no finality that actually functions in this kind of like retroactive manner to give meaning and like energy to life. In the same way, play functions in that way, right? And so what I'm saying with this is, in play, for it to actually work, there needs to be some engagement, whether at the level of fantasy or in actuality with another person. There needs to be that element of risk. I take away their toy, they might hit me on the head. I say this, they might not like what I'm saying. So I need to tailor what I'm saying to them so I can try to get what I want, which is that truck that they got over there, right? That sort of thing. When we're left with very little options for having that sort of engagement, it doesn't bode well for us as humans. It's as simple as that, right? So I'll leave it at that. Todd, I know you have a question, and I think then that'll be it for today.
Well, let me respect your time and just say a couple of things really very, very quickly, which is that there seems to be an unspoken implication to your to the certainty of your dystopian view, which is that we've got to get off our butts and do something about this. If this was an environmental crisis, which is going to have an inevitable destructive impact, we would want to do something to turn off the smokestack. This smokestack can't be turned off. So it seems to me there's a question of how does one hold on to one's humanity in the face of that particular vision of how technology is distorting the future, because it is distorting the future. But at the same time, there's the other side of it. And the previous question, I think, makes a really good point, which is that, yes, we use language of psychosis, masturbation, addiction, the inevitability of, the destruction of humanity. But another image which might be useful is the kind of the classic pharmacon, that artificial intelligence is simultaneously remedy and poison. And if we inattend to the remedy side, and only focus on the poison, which I think you are brilliant at articulating, we're missing half the picture. And one other thing I want to say, which is thank you so much for joining the CAI for this workshop. Really appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. It gives me an opportunity to kind of like get out there some of the stuff that's been bubbling in my mind more recently. So thank you. It's been of great benefit to me. So, but I think this is actually a wonderful way of ending, Todd. So I think you gave the perfect sort of question. I don't really see much remedy in AI, and I get the idea of the pharmacon, right? It brings both aspects, right? And you have to attend to both. But I don't really see any remedy. And that idea of mine is premised on the question of, why are we doing this at all? Why engage with AI at all? What are we going towards, right? Our whole civilization is based on the idea that we're going somewhere, and that somewhere that we're going is good, and that the sacrifices and the pains that we go through in life, right, are worth it because we're all aiming at this thing. That to me is a giant delusion. So we are already there. We've been there. There is nothing coming down the pike, in my estimation, right, that actually provides something more than what we already have. I think it's our incapacity to actually sit with what we already have and to actually take meaning and attribute value to those things. That's what propels us to go for things like AI, like there'll be something tantalizing, something important there. I don't think there's anything there, right? And so for me, that's like a baseline thing that operates in my head. I also see it in the clinic, this constant chasing after something, and people not attending to what they have right in front of them that could actually provide them with real sustenance and meaning in their life. However, I think there is the point you're making, Todd, which is, okay, but we can't stop the juggernaut. At some level, I think you're right. You're very right. I mean, it's not like me giving this talk is gonna like somehow everybody's gonna see the light and just like, we'll all go and like take nice hikes in a forest and like not attend to all this other, jazz that's really like doing us in. I think it becomes at some level like a question of choice, right? And I want to say that I think is both important and is also sad. That in lieu of collective action that might actually change things, right? We're left with a situation in which personal choice then becomes a way of actually attending to something, right? But I think there is something important about making the choice on a daily basis to not engage with the kind of relationships and engagements that actually do us great harm and that do the social fabric great harm, right? One of the things that I wanted to say to Francie before she left is, okay, maybe there's a possibility for play with AI, that it might be generative and actually useful. Maybe. I don't really think so, but I could hold out the slight possibility that that's the case. But even if that were the case, my question quickly becomes, is it worth it? Is it worth it? We don't tend to ask that question, right? Is it worth it to put the social fabric, right, into jeopardy? Is it worth it for us to increase our alienation from each other so we can have an engagement with AI? And my response to that is no, it is not worth it, right? I think the most important and valuable things in life are the ones that are most easily lost, right? And that's mostly our connection with each other. And that's what I think we're experiencing wholesale, right? So for me, it's kind of like a sad response, because again, it's not one of collective action, it's one of individual choice. But I think at this point, that's one of the few things that we have left and on our side is to make that kind of choice. And so I do, right? I do everything I can to not look at screens. I do everything I can to not engage with these kind of things. Although, like I said earlier, the technologies are ubiquitous. They're everywhere now. It's very difficult to not engage with them, right? So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Fernando. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you everyone for being here, and I will say goodbye.